Hey everyone, Mr. Chaffin here. Today we're going to continue down the road of the causes of the American Revolution. And so to start off, I just want to throw out a few things and see what comes to mind for you. So if I said Hollywood, Los Angeles, New York City, Nashville, New Orleans, San Antonio, Houston, all these cities, for one, are giant cities in America, but they also are known for something. So whether it's music, movies, food, fashion, or maybe just a good old, fashion landmark, maybe a famous landmark. Every one of these cities, pretty much every city is known for something. And so in our topic today, in our discussion today, we're going to talk about another city during the American Revolution, or at least that revolutionary era, that was also known for something. And so the city we're talking about is Boston, Massachusetts. And, Boston was pretty much in the spotlight for this entire colonial and revolutionary era. And that's for a pretty good reason. It had become really almost single-handedly the busiest trading port and social center in all of the 13 colonies. And so, we want to focus today on, what it was being in the spotlight for. And it's not just being a trade center, but it also was sort of ground zero for the tension between the British government and the colonists, okay? For starters, Boston was home to and sort of, originated this group called the Sons of Liberty. And so when you think Sons of Liberty, it's kind of funny to me, but think Sons of Anarchy. So if you're familiar with the show, Sons of Anarchy, think Sons of Anarchy, but minus the choppers, minus the skulls, and minus the cool sleeveless jackets, all right? But keep the crime, keep the guns, and keep the sort of overall sense of being like super awesome and super intimidating and basically troublemakers, all right? So these guys like Samuel Adams and John Hancock, Paul Revere, eventually guys like Patrick Henry. These are all sort of leaders in this movement called the Sons of Liberty. All right. And so anger toward the British had reached a tipping point in about 1765 when their parliament passed what was called the Stamp Act without the permission or the consent of the colonists. And so they come up with this slogan, this sort of official slogan of, taxation without representation is tyranny. All right. So the shorthand of that is no taxation without representation. And so basically it's saying, you can't tax us unless we have an opinion or representation in Parliament. Okay, so they held protests and they held boycotts in response to the tax. They even went as so far, and get this, you can Google this if you want, to tar and feather British tax officials who were loyal to the crown and are actually responsible for collecting these taxes. And so in doing things like that, again, go Google it if you're that interested. But the message was clear. The Sons of Liberty were going to target people who collected taxes for the king. So if you were one of those tax collectors, you were basically a marked man. And so the Sons of Liberty were basically these patriot gangsters that had earned Boston a reputation for being really the city where America's revolution began. And we'll kind of figure out later on that it actually is the city where America's revolution began. Okay. So besides just protests and boycotts about taxes, the city would be the site of a terrible event. So this is sort of like fast forwarding several years. But in 1770, it would be sort of host to really one of the most kind of momentous events of this entire revolutionary era. It gets a lot of airplay, it gets a lot of press, and that is the Boston Massacre. Okay? And so on the night of March 5th, 1770, a group of angry Bostonians were sort of just kind of going through the streets. Tensions were at an all-time high between the British and the colonists. And the British by this point had essentially occupied Boston with troops. And so there was this outpost of the British Army. And there were roughly 7 to 10 troops that were sort of stationed outside this outpost, sort of just standing guard, watching the area. And a group of protesters, a mob of about 60, encountered this group of British redcoats. And so there was a lot of emotion, clearly. Think of like a current day protest or riot. A lot of emotion, a lot of really a lot of confusion, maybe even a lot of just not knowing what's going on in the moment. And so in the end, the troops ended up firing on this crowd of about 60 people. And when it was all said and done, 5 had been killed, including what has become really the most famous victim of this night was a black sailor named Crispus Attucks. He was the first to die. So actually one of the first engravings of the entire Revolutionary era that sort of stuck with us is an engraving of this event. It was made by Paul Revere, and so an engraving is what they would actually print on the newspaper. So this image of the Boston Massacre became this really famous image of the Revolution. Well, obviously, things in Boston didn't get any better, and so that's where, a series of cause-effect events sort of fast forward us now to 1773, and Parliament does something, again, not real smart. They pass the Tea Act, also without the consent of the colonists. So all of these taxes are being done without the representation of the colonists in Parliament. And so it demanded that all tea be purchased from the British East India Company, which was sort of like a government-owned company. And so basically what they were trying to do is create a monopoly on tea. And so the Tea Act actually lowered the tax on British tea, but what it did is that it actually made it really hard for smuggled tea to be brought into the colonies. And so the colonists were forced into buying British tea, or they were forced to pay a higher price for smuggled tea. So they had to kind of pick and choose. Do I want to be a true patriot and pay more for smuggled tea, or do I want to pay less for the British tea, even though it's being forced on me? And so reaction to the Tea Act was, pretty quick, pretty harsh. The Sons of Liberty, organized by Samuel Adams, he's sort of their leader, they took to the streets and put together really one of their boldest plans yet. They dressed up like Mohawk Indians. They had actually met a little bit earlier in the evening. Several thousand Bostonians gathered in a meeting hall. And they actually decided in the end that just gathering and complaining wasn't going to do a whole lot. They needed to act on their frustration and their anger. So they go to Boston Harbor, and there's 3 ships they knew coming in that night with a fresh shipment of British tea. And they end up, tossing about 92,000 pounds of British tea overboard, roughly $1 million worth of inventory. And so it's probably one of the most famous acts of civil disobedience in American history. And so, as you can imagine, King George III, or KG3, he's all kinds of mad. And so in 1774, he passed a series of laws called the Intolerable Acts, also known as the Coercive Acts, by the way. And these laws, basically had one purpose: to punish Boston, to punish Massachusetts. Okay, and so highlights of these laws. I think there were 4 of them, if I remember correctly. They shut down Boston Harbor, so there goes their economy. They actually rewrote the Constitution of Massachusetts, which took away their power that they had, sort of assumed for themselves. So bye-bye government. And then they took away legal rights. They forced them to feed and house British troops in private homes. That's called the Quartering Act. And so, the king had one purpose in this, and that was to punish, okay? So in response to this, the Patriots got pretty serious now. So the Boston Tea Party was them kind of acting out, lashing out a little bit. But the Intolerable Acts kind of got their attention, because really now the king was going after the things that mattered most to them, which was their economy and their government. Okay. And so they had a meeting of the colonies called the First Continental Congress, and they're trying to figure out the best way forward. And so what they did agree on is that they weren't going to pay for the tea. They weren't going to pay the British crown back for the tea. And they were going to start forming militias, which were like these citizen armies. Okay. And so when we come away from this lesson today, we kind of need to know basically just a few basic things. And that is, we need to be able to analyze why the Boston Tea Party and the Intolerable Acts were causes of the American Revolution. So in other words, when we think of cause, effect, it's this chain of events that basically leads to an eventual outcome. And so when we consider that King George III eventually, what he eventually did to Boston, with the Intolerable Acts, what came before that? Okay, what came before that to eventually cause the Intolerable Acts? Okay, so British action, colonial reaction. Like that's sort of our big takeaway today. All right, so that's basically it today. That's a lot to unpack. So if you have any trouble sort of unpacking that cause effect chain of events, send me an email. I'll make sure that we clarify it for you. Until next time, I'm pretty excited to get to the next lesson because really we start diving into the war itself and the Declaration of Independence, which is such a cool topic to talk about. So I'm really excited to get to teach that to you guys. But yeah, until then, I will see y'all soon. Bye, y'all.